Culture Leadership Podcast. So glad that you would join us for this conversation and for these episodes. We love making them and love hearing your guys' feedback. I'm Becky Johnson, and I am excited because today I have two new guests, a new co-host.
That's right.
I don't think you've ever co-hosted with me.
I haven't. Maybe over the Zooms. We did Zooms back in the day.
But you're my husband.
But I am your husband. My name is Derek. And we love this podcast. It's going to be amazing.
So
it's gonna be fun.
Derek's joining me to co-host today, and we have our guest on.
Woo! Taylor Horn, the one and only.
That's right.
And I so appreciate you bringing me on today. I'm excited to be here with you guys.
I'm really excited. I think that the struggle will be to keep this episode in the time limits. I actually thought about maybe we need to do 2 or 3 episodes on this, and maybe we will. But we're just going to jump right in. We're talking about healthy sexuality. We're talking about healthy manhood, how these conversations emerge in the church. We're going to talk about pornography. We're going to talk about it.
So buckle up. You're probably on your commute and you were like, great, I'm just going to put on the podcast today and dive in, but buckle up. We're going to get into it.
These are really important conversations to have. And so we actually, we joke when Brandon and I host this, I don't like the intros of podcasts. I'll skip like the first couple minutes because I know it's just the banter and the fluff. So when I'm leading, we're just going to
get right into
it.
Yeah.
Just start dropping bombs. Yes.
So Taylor, some context for Taylor. Taylor has been a part of the Jesus Culture community, I feel like forever since we began. Yeah. So for over 10 years since we planted the church, he's been here, him and his wife, Paige, and they have adorable children, and they're just a part of our community, leaders in our community. He leads a men's group here at Jesus Culture Sacramento that goes beyond even our church, other men in the community that he'll talk about in just a bit. It's called Manhood Men's Group. And this podcast was birthed from a conversation that Taylor and I had not that long ago about really talking about healthy sexuality in the church, I think would be the overarching concept. We started talking about why don't we have these conversations and the importance of them among Christian circles and in a hypersexualized culture, recognizing that God created sex. He is the originator and inventor. And so this funny cultural shift where Christians have just sequestered this conversation away and it's, a weird conversation to have, or it's inappropriate. We're just kind of reclaiming all those things and bringing this to the forefront. So I loved our conversation, Taylor, and it's given me so much to process. And we're doing some things here at Jesus Culture Sacramento that I thought, let's bring this to the podcast. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, well, once again, thanks for having me. I feel honored and privileged to be here with you guys, and this is something I love to talk about, and I don't really mind having uncomfortable conversations, even if they're still uncomfortable for me at times.
Yeah.
I think that's where a lot of growth comes from, is having conversations around topics that might feel a little bit off limits or taboo, because it's good to grow and discuss and dialogue about things that maybe you have an opinion about, but you don't know why you have that opinion or things like that. So, should I give a little bit of background?
Yeah, I'd love to so I would say if you're going to talk about sex, about pornography, Taylor's your guy.
I don't mind.
But what intrigues me is why are you the guy and how did you get here? When we were talking, Taylor, I was really just impressed, I guess is the word, of the depth of your knowledge on this and your passion for it and your ability to say things in words. I'm like, wow, with no ounce of shame, you didn't recoil. And honestly, when we left that conversation, I thought that is such a picture of healthy conversations around this.
It was freedom, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how did you get to being the guy that we bring on to have this convo?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So there's a bunch of ways that people have said this over time. Chris Valentin says it one way. Different ministries say it different ways. One of the first ways I ever heard this concept was an old African proverb. The old African proverb says, "The wound is close to the blessing." And so I have been wounded in a lot of my sexuality. I've dealt with a whole lot of shame, and I can share more about that. But growing up, I dealt with a lot of shame around my sexuality, a lot of hidden sin, sexual sin, a lot of feeling condemnation around my own sexuality, confusion, my sexual identity, those kind of things. And so as I have over the years, and this is a super short synopsis, but as I've gotten a lot of healing around those, that wounding has turned into a blessing, and that blessing has turned into a calling. And so I feel excited to talk about porn and sex and shame and sexual sin and immorality, because I feel like there's a mandate on me from the Lord to give what I've received. And I've been forgiven much, and I want to love much. And so, I'm here to talk about it with anybody and everybody who is willing to listen, because I think that sexuality is such a gift from God. Our sexuality is an asset and not a liability. And I think historically, inside and outside of the church, but specifically inside of the church, we've viewed our sexuality as something to be managed, something to kind of be hidden, something that is only takes place behind closed doors, and that's not the reality of sexuality. Ooh, that rhymed.
See, you're born to be a podcaster.
Of sexuality.
Yeah,
Let's go.
Good at this.
But God created us in His image. And this might be, if we're going to jump right in the deep end right away, like if God created us in His image, if God created sexuality, that means that God is a sexual God. Now, we could go down that road, and that might be a little like, how do we comprehend that? Like, what do our belief systems say about that? But we really are, and God created sex to be beautiful and bountiful and loving and intimate, and not something that we need to like just try and manage until we die, and try and something that we like keep at bay, or something that only happens behind these closed doors when we get married. Yes, that is the act of sex, or intercourse or things like that. But really, we're walking around as sexual humans wherever we go, and so, let's talk about it. Let's find healing. Let's figure out what does it look like to thrive in our sexuality, and not just kind of figure out how to manage it or how to keep the sin at bay or things like that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think, even what so much of even in my own story is like one of the things you find out when you begin talking to, let's just say, other men, for instance, it's that for most of them, they've had a whole other life of secret sin. They've been wounded in this area of sin. They've, got into addiction and then actually the traumatic experiences that come from that. Like, there's a lot of trauma that men end up dealing with by what culture usually is selling us as something that's normal, it's acceptable. And so a lot of us get hidden away in that shame. And so we talk about this a lot, like when you're beginning to talk to other men about this issue, there's always that reluctance to actually come into the light. And I think of it a lot as, and I'd love to hear even, what this has looked like in your walking with men through this, but it's similar to like we have a hard time challenging people in areas where we don't actually have freedom. So of course sex is one of those areas. Like we'd have the same issue with the Bible. It's like, I don't read scripture much, so people I'm leading or people I'm talking to, I don't challenge them to do that because I'm not actually walking in that. And so the same thing can actually happen in areas of sexual freedom. I don't have it. And so I'm having a hard time leaning in and challenging other men in that area to have that freedom, which is, I think, one of those reasons why this issue does get put in the back room, and we don't know how to bring it out and talk about it. And we know the stats. We know the stats even in people in church leadership. You don't actually have freedom in this area, so we're not bringing it to the forefront. We're not actually challenging men in that. But I mean, what's that journey like for you, even as you're walking with men and you're sharing this, like that experience of when you open up with the vulnerability, when you open up and say, here's some of my past trauma. How often are you finding men who all of a sudden they're coming pretty unlocked and open just because someone would say, yes, hey, I've dealt with that. I've felt that trauma. I've been in that hiddenness. I felt that shame. I've been in that cycle. And then they actually begin to open up and see some light at the end of the tunnel.
I think the number one thing to start the conversation, and this has to happen internally, is we have to break off shame. Shame, I think, is the greatest enemy of healthy sexuality. Historically, in the church, we have shamed and hidden and kept it down and kept it at bay and tried to go like, well, just work that out on your own. Or, just fall more in love with the Lord and that'll all go away. And it's not that that's not true. Right. But that's not like the only answer. And so a lot of our approach in the past has been, well, I just need to pray more. I need to fall more in love with the Lord. I need to do this and this and this.
Try harder.
and try harder, right? It's just, I need to, have a little bit of grit, white knuckle this, starve it out, bounce my eyes. And what happens is that it takes it internal. It's an internal issue, and it's either mine alone or it's mine and God. This is just an issue between me and God. And so breaking off some of the shame, just even around the words and the usage, it's kind of funny. I talk to people sometimes, and I'm like, it's really. It would be a really quick way to find out what you believe to be true about sex and sexuality is trying to talk to your kids about it. Like, you want to know what you believe to be true about sex? Go try and talk to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old. You're going to find out really quickly what you believe to be true, what your belief systems are. And so, opening the door to having conversations, candid conversations about sexuality, the good and the bad, the scary, the highs, the lows, because like you just mentioned, statistically, it's pretty staggering and shocking results. It's not getting better in church society as well as, secular society. Porn consumption is only going higher and higher. The usage is only getting more and more prevalent in our society, in our churches. And so, starting the dialogue, I have found over the years that, like, if you just go first, and you really, it is hard to speak to something you don't have freedom in, and frankly, you probably really shouldn't speak to it with any level of authority or knowledge. But there's always opportunity to be vulnerable. And so my approach has been, when I'm talking to men, when I'm leading groups, when I'm talking to groups of people, is come in with vulnerability. A friend of mine used to say, the most vulnerable person in the room is the most powerful person in the room, because you've got nothing to lose. And so just understanding that vulnerability is actually a strength and not a weakness. And I think that shame wants to keep us from being vulnerable. Shame wants to keep us from being known. We have this belief system that if you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. And so we have this, we walk around in fear, like, oh, what if I get found out? Right? And the irony of overcoming unwanted sexual behavior, sexual sin, those kind of things, is you have to be willing to face it head on. Ironically, it's the very thing that hurts you is the very thing that'll heal you. And that's kind of even going back to what I said, the wound is close to the blessing. And so we all are sexual beings. We're all sexual people. And if we're not willing to talk about it, then our sexuality gets stagnant, and it gets hidden, and it begins to get perverted or toxic. And so men and women both, we need to be able to talk about it without shame.
And I think this conversation is so important, especially in Christian circles, because what we know to be true for being in church and ministry for a long time is often we see sexual sin and immorality, and you're outcast from the, like, that was why that person lost their job. They became, they're weird. They just get pushed out. And I think that's because we don't know how to navigate this conversation in Christian circles. So when we're talking, I'm dreaming of when someone is able to say, I am struggling with pornography. I was molested and I have so much shame. There is a church that goes, we know how to help you get freedom. But I think we don't know that yet. And so I think that's some of these conversations. And you have such good resources, which we can maybe give at the end of the podcast for where people can start. But Taylor, as you're talking, I'm like, God, it's just so clear that you're not just speaking from theory. There was a friend, a married couple we have, and the guy, he's like, I've never struggled with porn. I've never been sexually abused. And he's recognized, he goes, there's just so much that I don't know. I don't understand how to counsel men through it. And as you're talking, just the evident freedom that you have, how did you said shame is the enemy of healthy sexuality. So for people listening, and probably already, there's probably a tremendous amount of shame that is getting triggered in people because they've never talked about this. They've never, looked at this internally. What would be some of the ways to start to remove shame so that they can even begin this journey?
Yeah. I think one of the number one things we can do as leaders, and if you're listening to this and you are in a leadership role in your church, is begin to redefine what unwanted sexual behavior, and let's say specifically porn, what is porn trying to solve? Because porn is not the problem. Porn is an attempt to resolve a problem. Right? So unwanted sexual behavior is an attempt at healing pain. And so we all have stories, we all have pain, if I need to legitimize this for a second, just look at the different genres of porn that are out there. And those are direct reflections of either a reenactment of past pain and trauma or a replication of past pain and trauma. And so that's why there's so much diversity. Like if you want to, look something up inappropriate online, like you can find anything and everything that you're looking for because it speaks to a certain part of your soul. It speaks to a pain problem that you have. Yeah. And so, porn is not the church's problem. Unwanted sexual behavior is not the church's problem. It's actually an attempt to resolve the problem. But we're doing it as individuals, and we're doing it in secrecy, and it's getting darker and darker. But yeah, we have to approach it in a way that is not sin or not sin, but really is like, what is the story behind this? What is the story behind, for somebody who's maybe never struggled with it before, it's hard to empathize and be compassionate toward those people because you're like, well, just stop. That's sick, that's perverted, that's sinful, so dark. Just stop. But it's there's like a soul level issue that's going on that we try and resolve. And I think why specifically sexuality and sexual sin is such a big issue is because it speaks to the core of who we are. Yeah. When God breathed life into Adam and then he took Eve from Adam's ribs, like there was such an intimate soul level exchange happening there. And then God, right from there went and said, be fruitful and multiply. And in that, you have to assume he gave us a sex drive if he's wanting us to multiply, right? And so there's something like foundational. Our sexuality is a foundational thing. And so it only makes sense that the devil would want to go after that, right? Yeah. And there's all kinds of other sins out there, obviously, but sexual sin, it even says in the Bible, is a sin against oneself. Like it's a soul sin. Wow. And that's why it's so costly. But once it's redeemed, it's also so beautiful. Yeah. And so I think that's why there's been an attack on the church specifically. Like, hey, let's not talk about this. Let's avoid this. And I think that's a plan of the devil. Yeah. So I think we can begin to just start the conversation. Yes. And approach it with curiosity, not condemnation, not judgment, not accusation. But if I were to tell you, hey, I looked at porn last night, a good approach maybe on your side would be, well, why do you think that happened? And it's not, well, I was just so aroused. Like, well, tell me about your day. Well, my boss yelled at me. My wife rejected me. My kids said they hated me. Oh, maybe there's a story behind that. Wow. Right? And then you can trace those back. A friend of mine says our sexual arousal template or sexual fantasies have a direct correlation to the stories that shaped us as children, specifically like before the age of 15 usually. Those are like more of the foundational stories. Wow. So yeah, like, and it's so weird to think about that because you're like, a lot of the answers to this has just been like, well, just stop. Yeah. Yes. But we're not making these decisions to sin like in a vacuum. There's so much that contributed to that, so much childhood upbringing that directly play into that. And then, like I said earlier, usually the how that comes out is either a replication of those stories, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, or a rejection of those. Wow. So it's going to look like this was done to me, and so I'm going to seek out the opposite of that. Wow. Or this was done to me, and sadly and in a kind of a yuck way, I'm going to replicate that because there's some familiarity. Right. And maybe that's how I was shown love. And even, and I'm not talking about like these big sexual abuse stories, though it can be that, but maybe it was just my dad was very distant as a child. I was a latchkey kid. And so I was home alone a lot, and I was feeling alone and I was feeling isolated. And then you begin to seek out unwanted sexual behavior that actually reaffirms that because there's something comforting in that. Wow. Yeah. Gosh, it's so powerful. What you're saying too is like, you got to expose. And I think too, there's the purity culture kind of, in its best attempts trying to do good. I think I wasn't raised in that, and we weren't raised in the church. So the purity culture, but we have had to counsel people out of it. And I'm like, whoa, what was happening? Mm-hmm. Like we were just, stop, you're not sexual, fast it. And like, and there's all this, there was just this underbelly of unwanted sexual behavior that could not come to light. And so I do think,
redeeming our own, like the church's own past with it is really important. It's so needed. And so I love this conversation. There's so many, I'm like, I want to do so many.
And there is a thing, it does play into, there's a key thing that you're saying that I think whether, again, like you're saying, if you're leading people and if you could lay out this framework for why this has maybe been a lifelong struggle for them, or to ask yourself the question, what were those experiences in childhood? Even just to be exposed to pornography at a young age is a traumatic experience. It's a very graphic sexual experience that you're having. You don't know how to make sense of it. That whole situation can be traumatic. And then the addiction itself is somehow I am trying to deal with that initial trauma by coming back to the same well again. Yeah. So for people to begin understanding that, whether in your own journey or people that you're leading, there are usually these root moments or these root issues, these root wounds that are robbing you of this beautiful freedom that you can have in sexuality, which is kind of the whole other side of the coin, which I don't know if we would go into this, but it is the beauty that, it's probably a bit easier to understand when you're inside the context of a marriage, that you begin understanding, well, one of the reasons why the freedom is so incredible is that when you're fully activated sexually and alive and it's whole, it's the most incredible
godly experience.
Experience that you can have. Yeah. All the shame is chased completely out the door because you're not under that thing anymore. You've actually seen, your sexuality redeemed, and it's a very different experience.
I want to pivot the conversation a little bit with our time because I really want Taylor to touch on this, and I do think we probably need a part 2 and 3 because there is so much content here. I'd love to talk to how would you counsel single people right now growing up in a living in a hypersexualized culture? Purity culture is kind of like, okay, we've figured out that doesn't work. So what is the church's culture for our singles to help them, But I want to talk about manhood. Your group is called Manhood Men's Group. Yep. I love the way you talk about healthy masculinity and what that looks like. I love clickbaity things. I love going, I want to call this like toxic masculinity. I love what's happening in culture, and I just, that stuff gets me riled up. But there's toxic masculinity, and if you're a man, you're bad, and you're abusive, and don't be tough because tough men are bad.
Yes.
I love what our church is doing with masculinity. I love the journey my husband has been on with this. I have had my own very scary experiences with men in my childhood. And so I talk about healthy masculinity in churches. As we raise up, there's female empowerment in churches too, and that's awesome and that's beautiful, but we don't want to do that at the expense of raising up our men and our sons. Tell me a little bit about why you call it manhood and your thoughts there.
Yeah. So just real quick, it's funny that in church and in society in general, we just tend to swing back and forth, right? Yeah. Like the pendulum just swings, right? It's like we have a Republican president, and we have a Democrat president, and we have a Republican. Like, somebody needs to solve this problem, and so it's like, this isn't working. Let's do this other extreme thing to see, right? And so where there was like a lot of liberation in the church, probably. In like the 60s, 70s around sexuality. Then it was like, well, holy cow, this isn't working, right? The Jesus movement, like Jesus people, they started to come in, and it was like, no, we need to shut that down. Yeah. And I think that's where like the purity culture was kind of birthed. And that lasted probably until like the, like 2000s, mid 2000s. And then what's happened again is we've kind of gone, hey, that doesn't work. Yeah. We can't just shame this. We can't just shut it down. We can't just say, well, like close that door until, your honeymoon night, then it's all going to get better and it's going to be amazing, because that doesn't work either. But what we can't do is then once again switch back to this lawlessness, like God's grace is sufficient and it covers everything, which is true. But like what happens is we start to abuse that grace. And then we start to create our own theologies around our sexualities. And it once again just becomes, this is my issue.
Yeah, that's right.
Or this is my issue with the Lord, and this is my own theology. And a lot of that just comes from stopping reading the Bible. Like the Bible actually really talks about sex and sexuality a lot. Yeah. Yep. And we don't have to skip over those parts. We don't have to be fearful of those parts. They were put in there for a reason. Whether it's sexuality, whether it's masculinity, whether it's politics, we don't have to just constantly switch back and forth. So we can have open dialogue. We can find a healthy middle ground, a healthy solution and answer. Yeah. And so to speak to the manhood men's group, what does healthy masculinity look like? How do we not make it toxic masculinity, if that's a thing? The answer is not swinging back and forth from like women's empowerment to toxic masculinity. And there's this power grab and power struggle. We were created to work in collaboration and interdependence, men and women. And so the best answer to that question is healthy masculinity looks like Jesus.
Yes.
You know, we've started saying it around here a little bit. I've been saying it for like a couple of years. Like, my goal in life is just look more like Jesus every single day. If I can do that, I've accomplished. Like, Jesus was the perfect role model for men and women, but I'm a man, and it's really easy to relate to that. But look at him. Like, no, he wasn't toxic, but he was assertive, right? He was meek, but he was also very blunt and courageous. And so I think sometimes we kind of cherry pick the attributes and characteristics of Jesus, and we still probably tend to lean towards the feminine characteristics of Jesus. We've built a lot of churches around the feminine characteristics of Jesus.
He was
but
nurturing. He was kind.
We're not usually as comfortable with the "get behind me, Satan" Jesus.
Or the flipping tables,
Or the flipping tables. He's making a whip, probably using it. You know, I can't imagine he just did it for fun.
Or willfully taking on a cross.
Right.
That's
Exactly. Like so much really blunt, maybe you can call it harsh, but like kind language. Jesus was so kind, but he wasn't always the nice person that we make him out to be. And so understanding that and really looking at Jesus' life holistically, reading the whole Bible in its entirety, really understanding the character of God, I think that's how we shape what healthy masculinity looks like. We don't have to swing back and forth. We can really begin to go, yes, Jesus was gentle, right? But he was also kind, and he was blunt with people. Like, literally in one chapter, he's saying to Peter, like, I'm going to build my church on you, right? And then just a couple sentences later, he's literally saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? And you're like, whoa, wait, like, am I your favorite, or am I like your worst enemy?
Or my big devil?
Like, how do I deal with this? How do I hold that? And just understanding that Jesus was such a powerful person, and so loving. Like, he encompassed love and gentleness and kindness, but he was also very assertive, and he wasn't passive.
I love that. I love that healthy masculinity looks like Jesus.
That's right.
That's so amazing.
That's so good.
What would you say to women listening who are like, this is scary. This is scary. This is inappropriate. I don't want to go there. What would you just say to them listening? Like, what are some places they could begin, or maybe their church does not have these kinds of conversations, and their experiences. I could think 15 years ago, if I heard a conversation like this, I'd probably be turning it off and like going and crying somewhere. And so what would you say to and maybe men too listening, going, oh man, I am terrified of these conversations. What is a place that they could start? Is there a resource? Is there a place they could go to begin to uncover some of these roots and maybe those deeper issues?
So on the subject of healthy sexuality, I think we have to understand first and foremost, this isn't a men's issue. This issue isn't, or let's say unwanted sexual behavior is not a men's problem. And healthy sexuality is something that we all get to be a part of. God created all of us in his image. And so first and foremost, we have to approach the subject as one together. We have to have these conversations, not just as men and not just as women. I remember in fifth grade or whatever it was, where we get the lesson.
The puberty talk.
The puberty talk at church. It was like, we're going to separate all the boys and we're going to separate all the girls. And that's probably good at fifth grade level. But like now as adults, we can't be segregating this problem into your issue, or like this is a men's issue, because we all are created sexual, and our unwanted sexual behavior can come out, and the symptoms of that can look different between men and women just because of the way that God designed us.
The stats even though of pornography for women, right? The last stat I read, it was 8 out of 10 men and 7 out of 10 women. So I mean, it's not... No, we don't talk about that.
And it's only getting worse in a hypersexualized culture. It's only getting worse. Porn consumption is the statistics are elevating between men and women both. So this isn't just like specifically porn consumption is not just a men's issue anymore. It's a women's issue. It's a children's issue.
Yes.
I mean, they say the average age of exposure now is 6 to 7.
That's
to porn. And if you're not having conversations that directly are interacting with, word porn and sexuality and things like that, by the age of 8, then you've likely already missed your opportunity to get before the first exposure. So a common language is 8 is too late to be talking about this with your kids at this point. And it doesn't mean you have to like go in like the most explicit version of it, but like start having the conversation. One of my favorite things that a friend of mine says is it's better around the topic of sexuality with your kids specifically. It's better to have 100 1-minute conversations than one 100-minute conversation.
Wow, that's so good.
We have to begin to just dialogue about this. And this is where it goes back to like, you want to know what you believe to be true about sexuality. Try talking to your kids about it. Now try talking to them about it 100 times.
They can't even say the names for genitalia. Like they call it things, Like I remember Chris Valentin taught us, like, don't call it a wee-wee and a hoo-hoo. Like say the words. And that was a paradigm shift for me. It was luckily before we had kids. But I remember teaching my daughter and just saying, that's your vagina. I was like, wow, am I molesting her by saying that? Like that's how much undoing I had to do. Right. And now it's so normal. Our kids are 11, 7, and 3, and it's just vagina and penis. And I will watch them say that to other. It's still, and I'm thinking, you get in your own little circles. I'm like, oh, we say this is fine. Everybody calls it this. No, people do not call it what it is. Because my kids will say that, and kids will look at them like they've just said a cuss word. And I'm like, wow, you don't want to say the word penis. That's crazy.
And you're like, well, that's what that is. But it was to the end of teaching our kids there's no shame in that. Don't have shame surrounding a part of your body.
This is who you were created to be. You were created to be a sexual person.
And to think about just calling it a pet name instills in you that's inappropriate. You have to call it something else. We couldn't actually say what it is. That's it.
Our sexuality is really, at the end of the day, it's not something to be hidden. It's something to be shown. Now, you can do that in a healthy way, right? I'm saying there's privacy and we need to be private about things. But our sexuality is, once again, not something that takes place behind closed doors. It's something that we carry with us wherever we are. And our stories and our history are affecting the way that we view the world, that we view sexuality. So going back to your question really quickly, because I do know we need to end here, is some resources around this. Number one thing we can do is we can start the conversation. And we need to start the conversation with curiosity. So whether you're a spouse wanting to talk to your spouse, you're wanting to talk to your kids are approaching you, is approach the conversation with curiosity and not accusation. It's going to be really hard not to bring your own stuff into the conversation, but we have to force ourselves to do that. We have to start practicing healthy conversations around sexuality. So that would be the number one thing, is if you want to talk about it, approach the conversation with curiosity, not judgment. That'll go light years into the future. That'll get you almost all the way there. The other things is there's great books around this. A lot of the books are, and I won't blast any books that were like really purity culture heavy, but a lot of the books in the past were a lot of like management, symptom management, white knuckle, snap the rubber band if you're struggling. It was totally and only a men's issue. Women need to protect their sexuality. Men need to go and get it, right? We need to fight for our, fight for the women to be able to give it up, right? And that's what you're like fighting for your honeymoon night. You're like, I'm gonna fight and I'm gonna, that's not what we need to be doing anymore. So there's some great books out there. One of my favorite books is a book called Unwanted. And men and women, it's great. It's written for both men and women. Unwanted, Overcoming Unwanted Sexual Behavior, and how our stories have led us to where we're at really in our sexuality. That's by an author named Jay Stringer. I'd highly recommend that. A good legacy book that I've known about for a really long time, that's one of my favorites, is a book called Breaking Free. It's really specifically on overcoming porn usage and that kind of stuff, but it speaks really to the heart, to the soul of the matter as well. That's by an author named Russell Willingham. And then another thing that we can just do in our church is begin to get in groups. Like, this isn't your issue. Whoever's listening to this right now, you're not alone in this issue. Whether you're male or female, whether you're young or old, everybody has a sexuality. Everybody has some amount of unwanted sexual behavior, sexual brokenness in their life. We can all attain more freedom in this area because God created us to. But start having the conversations. Get in groups that are dedicated to the subject, dedicated to vulnerability, community. Those things are going to move the needle the most in your life, to be able to remove shame and help you to not feel so isolated, because isolation is like the Achilles heel of this thing.
That's good. Hey, let me just tell you too, as a pastor, if you're like, well, my church doesn't have a tailor, you can be that though. Like, you get free, get healthy, work on that, and come and say, guys, let's, even if you don't feel like you're the expert, say, let's go on this journey together. And Jay Stringer, you sent me the website, an amazing resource. If you want to see this happen in your church, I think men or women, just say, you know what, let's begin this conversation. If you know that the culture in your circle is, we don't talk about it, it is hush hush, it's the thing that married people do, this is what we're saying. Let's begin to break those cycles and open this conversation up. It's so needed. Taylor, I will say you deserve your own podcast. I think we just need to set this up for you weekly. Right. You need to come. I mean, this is awesome. Any other thoughts to add? I know you've had your own journey.
I think just probably the last thing I would add, and it's similar to everything that we're sharing here, is that whether when you're doing pastoral work, when you're doing discipleship, when you're walking with people, leading in vulnerability, it's one of the easiest things to do, like you said, just asking that open question. Hey, how are you doing in this area? How's this looking like? And allowing them to share what they're struggling with, and then being able to be vulnerable and say, yep, I've struggled with that too. Here's where I'm at. Here's some of those root causes that I had to go and deal with. And I think, like you said, this is probably one of my biggest takeaways from what we're talking about today. It was the African proverb that you started with. It's just that there is an initial wound that's in there. It's where all of this stuff actually is bleeding out of. And so, getting the right resources, getting with the Lord, doing the work to go and address that wound, and then the symptom of unwanted sexual behavior actually starts to go away as you receive healing. So I think it's phenomenal what you shared today. Yeah. It's awesome.
Thanks so much for having me, you guys.
Thanks so much for this conversation. I seriously, I think we need a part two probably to talk through some of them more.
Yes.
So awesome. All right, guys. Well, go and dive into this. This was a good
Get some books.
episode. Get some
do
books.
Some work. Have some conversations. And don't be ashamed.
The Lord loves you and your sexuality, even as it is.
Yes. Awesome. See you guys.